All right, everyone. Attorney General Barr is thinking about the possibility of using sedition charges against certain communistic protesters, rioters, really. But we'll use the term that the legacy media uses interchangeably because apparently most people seem to think that they're the same thing these days. To bring sedition charges against them because when people are, for political reasons, staging armed insurrections like you had at Chaz, when they're terrorizing people, when they're attacking stores and shutting them down and stealing things and shooting people, at some point sedition possibly creeps in as an explanation for, what's actually going on now. I prefer looking at it in a more holistic approach. When we look at, and I would differ from Barr and most conservatives, I think, in this, most of the people that are involved in the violence going on in Chicago, Kenosha, Los Angeles, places like that are not politically motivated. Most of the actual damage being done is by looters. They're not politically motivated. They're doing a smash and grab. They want to steal shit. Now, they're criminals. They should be charged in some cases vandalism, larceny, petty larceny, grand larceny, whatever, destruction of public property, public indecency in some cases, and things like that. If they can help it, if they're not confronted by a living thing, they tend to just loot. They're not really even necessarily prone to getting violent unless they're in large numbers. The problem is that those looters are only there, and those bits of violence and crime attendant to the political motive. The problem is the Antifa and BLM, which is a Marxist organization, self-proclaimedly. They're the ones that are actually causing the scenario in which that other crime is occurring. What happens is that you have protests. And at first they're peaceful, usually. They might be a little bit rowdy, but by and large they're lawful assemblies. You have a handful of Antifa members or some BLM antagonists, throw some rocks at the police, get them to fire some tear gas, and then it becomes a free-for-all. The rioting and looting, mainly of a non-political nature, wouldn't even have occurred if it weren't for the fact that in those situations, the police, because of the way in which police tend to structure their reaction to crime, have to focus inordinately on that crowd, and so then looting occurs elsewhere. People break off, they smash a window, they grab the Rolex. They smash the car window, they rip out the engine or something like that. They steal whatever they want. You now have instances in multiple U.S. cities where BLM thugs have broken into businesses and basically taken them over. In some cases, it takes the police hours to respond because they're stretched too thin. And in some cases, they're not really allowed to respond at all. You've got numerous mayors, governors, and judges trying to stand in the way of perfectly lawful policing, to the point where people don't seem to be able to differentiate the difference at this point between a lawful and unlawful assembly, between protesting and rioting. They see them as interchangeable. Or between a peaceful protest and a violent mob. Between the politically motivated rioting that's going on and mere looting, which is certainly attendant to it and caused in part by it, but it's not the same thing. I would support Barr in levying sedition charges against the more politically motivated individuals involved here. I also support deputizing basically all of the state police in the country at this point, because you have repeatedly had situations where DAs are refusing to prosecute, or they catch and release people who are engaged in felonious violent crime. They're doing it for political reasons. They're mainly doing it for political reasons because of this. And this is the big lie by omission. You've probably seen those little infographics that all the leftists are so fond of circulating, usually from like the SPLC or something. Oh, well, left-wing terrorism is so absent, it's only like a few cases, but look at these evil right-wingers. And of course, most of the time, religiously motivated stuff always, for some reason, is put on the right-wing spectrum, even if it's non-political. That inflates the numbers. If you have DAs in these cities, and the Antifa members know which DAs are doing this, of course. They're only rioting in places where they're assured of this. That's the whole fucking point. You have district attorneys who are ignoring felonious crimes. If the crime is not going to result in charges, or the person simply disappears because no bail is set and there's no real repercussions for them not showing up for their court date, so that they can't officially be convicted of any crime, no shit, it's not going to end up as a crime statistic, because there's no crime without a conviction. For those purposes, for the documented legal purposes of determining what kind of crime is happening, you have to actually attempt to charge the person. Antifa and BLM thugs know which cities in which the DAs have decided to essentially take a knee. And so that's where they're conducting their terrorism. If you wanted this to stop, all you would have to do is weaponize the federal judiciary and fall in with federal forces. And start arresting people and putting those that are legitimately politically motivated behind bars for the rest of their lives for terrorism. I would support doing that. The problem is that you would get a situation in which somebody who really just showed up to loot might be construed as politically motivated wrongfully simply because they happen to have documented political beliefs on social media. I don't want someone to go to prison for life because they spray painted the side of a federal courthouse because they were part of a group that got arrested, and then Barr comes and says, well, this person's Facebook posts indicate that they're far left, and they were part of this group and they were committing a crime, ergo sedition. They were sedition adjacent or something. That kind of policing would be unhelpful, number one, draconian and authoritarian, number two, and unconstitutional, really, number three. So what I would say to Barr is tread lightly in this particular situation. Make damn sure that you don't overcharge. But the optics of it alone would be terrible. It'd be terrible for the Trump admin, by the way, in a political sense, let alone the constitutional sense. Make sure that the person is actually motivated by politics in that situation and is actually engaged in a significant crime. Because I don't want someone who's engaged in something more minor, or they're not exactly sure, but they were part of this group, and this group, someone threw an IED and they think it was you, and then they get brought in for 20, 30 years into federal prison. That's a little bit far for me. You've got to understand that at the end of the day, this is still only a handful of metro areas with sympathetic DAs and a lack of policing simply because the police forces are throttled by their local mayors and governors. That's what this boils down to. It's not a revolution. It can be sedition. Certainly you've got armed insurrection when you talk about Chaz or something like that. But if the DAs aren't willing to charge, and the courts aren't willing to go through with the case and actually convict, of course there's no left-wing terrorism because they're not getting convicted. Not because there's no left-wing terrorism, but because you've got DAs that refuse to take the case. That's about all. Peace out.